Welcome to another special from Window World. We've had a few weeks off and I've been preparing an audio book which I've talked about previously, and that will be available soon. So tonight we're going to carry on with our deep dive into history, and particularly the Shattered Isles and the shows that we did previously about the Druids. So I'm going to be referring to several documents tonight, and the whole purpose of these shows is to have philosophical purpose and directed information which is of use to the viewer, so that we don't have any shows which are merely full of waffle. And I do get sent a lot of that stuff, and that's the purpose really now of Windows on the World, is this lifelong learning project which seems to be appreciated by a select few, which is a good thing. And it's all about a learning process. And one thing I wanted to bring up was that there has been a massive infiltration of historical misinformation through the New Age and the adoption of the ancient traditions, as though the people who are making these cartoons and dressing up in fancy dress really is what they're doing, has kind of diminished the spiritual power of the original religion of the British Isles, and also Christianity, which was absorbed by the Druids. So we're going to be referring to several books this evening. One is The Riddle of Prehistoric Britain by Comyns Beaumont, Druids, The Ancient Faith of Britain by Dudley Wright, and Avebury by William Stukeley. So Riddle of Prehistoric Britain was written in the early part of this century, as was The Ancient Faith of Britain by Dudley Wright, and Avebury by William Stukeley was actually written in 1743. And these books give us an insight into what the history really was of the British Isles before the New Age infiltration. And I did put a show up a couple of days ago about that, because it's been in the archive a long time. It was about Maurice Strong, the UNCED conference, the Rio conference of '92, and the whole Gaia cult, which has been imposed as a business plan for the world, which we've done many shows on. So if we go back to the early part of this century and the late 1700s, we can find some unpolluted information which has not been infiltrated by New Age thinking, which is very important. There's a Druidic statement which is very relevant to this evening's show, and it goes like this: Nid dim ond Diw, nid Diw ond dim, which means God cannot be matter, and what is not matter is God. And that was a pretty profound statement by the Druids, which was from the book Avebury by William Stukeley. And we are used to places of worship being imitations of the past. In other words, cavernous cathedrals, a testament to the architectural achievement of man, really about the ego and the abilities and achievements of mankind in putting this ceiling where the sky should be. And that is one of the most important things about these ancient forms of worship. So cavernous cathedrals are testament to the architectural achievement of man, full of distractions. And before that, of course, churches and temples. So I'm going to read out something which is quite prescient to what we're going to be talking about. And it's from our series, The Perfected Minefield. And you can find that series in the playlists section on our YouTube channel. And this is from Ritual and Religion. And it talks about the modern world religion, which actually comes from a Latin word called religio. Now, according to the first definition available on the internet, religion is the belief in and worship of a superhuman controlling power, especially a personal god or gods. However, the word religio from the Latin, which predates it, describes something very different. Religio means to come into contact with the supernatural and the experience of that, which could bring both fear and awe. So this is not an experience which is merely some kind of pleasant insight We're talking about things which actually change our way of viewing the whole of reality. And that's what Religio was all about. And it meant fear in the respect that it was something outside the experience of the experience. So the whole idea of the church and the capturing of people through religion was to impose an experience on the experiencer through a third party. And this is an interesting fact. The Corpus Inscriptionum, which is a compendium of Latin words, does not now include the word religio, which was very popular in pre-Roman times and during the times of the Roman occupation in Britain. So the word predates any kind of state organized or sanctioned doctrine, which is probably why it's been taken out of use by the Roman Church. The word describes personal revelation independent of anything externally organized. So in effect, it means direct communication and communion with something outside everyday experience. And this is before the state had interfered, of course, intervened with organized religion. Direct revelations were brought into line with already established beliefs through a belief system. So religio was outside of and before the time of state-sanctioned doctrine, ritual and official administration of religious matters is what replaced religio. A quote now from Cicero, the Roman lawyer, and he stated, "Religio observes due ritual attention to a higher being, that which people call the divine. The direct experience is outside an organized ritual with its controlled incantations and actions." And we covered that in those particular shows, and it's very relevant to what we're going to be talking about this evening in this show. And in organized religions, we have become to a large extent robotic and empty through imposed ritual and dogma. So the word religio was used in everyday language, even by laymen in Roman times. However, religion, apart from religio and wisdom, are inseparable. So religio and wisdom are inseparable and separate from religion. So simply, religio describes the essence of the experience, not the ritual or church or organized practice or prayer. Any sacrifice is wholly within the mind of the worshipper, not an external thing. So when we go into the age of sacrifice, then the real sacrifice is of ourselves. So the realization is that sacrifice is of the self and the opening of the mind. That's what religio was really all about. And of course, the cult of Mithra was the absorption into decoy Christianity of Constantine. And the Pharisees' rules and rituals and the frocks of the Catholic Church retained ritual for the very purpose of compliance and control. So just before we get into the real body of this show, and the body of this show is in effect the true Jerusalem, which is the seeking of our real selves. So a sign came up with the feed that's coming from the fake state of Israel, the modern day state of Israel, is from the sign said, "The Jerusalem, the capital, there can only be one Jerusalem." So the fake one seems to be coming to an end, and the real Jerusalem is not a physical place. However, the real Jerusalem could well have been destroyed by Hadrian, but the land mass it is on remains, and that is in Scotland, Edinburgh. So if you check out our shows on Jerusalem, you can go to the homepage at windowsontheworld.net. There are 3 shows which state that the Jerusalem which we're talking about is not the Jerusalem which was relocated to the Middle East and the modern day state of Israel, which was created in 1948. Let's now get on to William Stukeley's Avebury, a temple of the British Druids, written in or published in 1743. I think Stukeley's very prolific, and he gets a bit wordy, as a lot of the people in the 1700s did, but there's some great information about the old religion and in particular, of course, Avebury. So in Stukely's Avebury, we find that a true temple was always round with no ceiling, or it was in an oak grove. So a true temple is not in a square building. This is very important because it seems that when the Freemasons stole from the Scandinavian occultists their rituals and the rituals of what were known of the ancient Druidic priesthood, that these temples became square, and the square and the compasses became the temples and the symbology of Freemasonry. So a very important point is that the real places of worship were the oak groves in ancient Britain and, of course, across Europe into many other countries around the world. And this is a very important thing we're going to get into in how the Cromlech and Dolmen builders actually expanded. It appears that it started in the British Isles and expanded outwards. And we have the cataclysm of 1322 BC described by Comyns Beaumont in The Mysterious Comet as the inciting incident for the building of these ancient shelters, in effect, bomb shelters, which were to protect people from what was falling out of the sky. Example being the comets which came and destroyed civilization. So a true temple is round with no ceiling. A grove was traditionally congruent with a temple. The corrupted temple was square and covered as in the tabernacle. So, in other words, even if the temples were round, they had no ceiling. So the sky is the true ceiling. And that's a very important point that Stukely makes in this particular book. I'm going to go now to Druidism, the Ancient Faith of Britain by Dudley Wright. The Druids held that the supreme being was too exalted to be confined within temples made with hands. Their open-air temples were circular in form, and in their worship they made use of the circle to intimate that God was to be found in every direction. The Druids believed that the eternal could not be limited locally to anywhere. So, in other words, when the celebration, festival, ritual, meeting had actually finished, there would be no trace of it. Nobody would know where these people worshipped because everything vanished into the ether, which is why they carried everything around in their heads through the oral tradition. All makes sense. So the Druids believed that the eternal could not be limited locally. So a perfect solution is also to have a non-local place. That means, of course, your temple can never be destroyed because your temple is carried around and it's in a natural surroundings. So this is much more practical than the later idea of temple building. So everything vanished into the ether and no one was the wiser under the temples of the oak trees. So let's now have a quote from Dudley Wright's book. There is no passage in any classical historical document which connects the Druids with any particular stone monument or temple. It is though believed that they occasionally used the stone circles, and the main place of worship in the British Isles was Avebury, which is described in his book as the Serpent Temple. That's in William Stukely's book, Avebury. He describes Avebury as the Serpent Temple, and this site predates Stonehenge. And the Druids, we have to remember, had their history rewritten by the Romans in favor of themselves. So the Druids believed the natural order is present in the natural world. The artifice of the controllers built majestic palatial structures, built on the idea of control and conquest in a way. Because if you were part of one of these original orders, then there would be no solid material place of worship, unless, of course, it was one of these major sites, which do include Stonehenge, many circles, of course, Callanish in Scotland, and all the ones throughout the British Isles and Brittany, of course, where the Druids extended. And we do Also, have to remember that the main centre of teaching for the Druids was the British Isles, and we had the Isle of Anglesey or Mona as one of their main places, the Isle of Wight and the Isle of Man, and of course spreading out into the Scottish Islands. So for real power and conducive connection to the natural world, they were connecting with the natural surroundings, which makes complete sense. So the real Israelites, according to Beaumont and according to the research that I've been doing over the past many years actually now, followed this system before, of course, the Pharisees and the scribes used their community control system of temples and man-made ritual. And of course, we can say the same thing for the Roman Church of Constantine. So this actually became a neurosis, which has ended up in what is happening today. So we're seeing the end of something, a manipulated man-made neurosis, when in fact it could have been more conducive to actually go along with the natural order of things and follow the true early Christianity, which, as we've said in these shows, was probably, and I would say most definitely, founded in the British Isles. So yeah, William Stukeley's Avebury, written in 1743. Give you some quotes because this is going to be a very dense show. One of the reasons I haven't done a show for a while was because I'm putting together quite a lot of information. Never want it to get stale and never want to repeat anything. Quote, "Whatever we find in history that looks like idolatry is not to be referred to the Aboriginal Druids, but to the later colonies from the continent. We find on the continent idolatry crept on by degrees universally, which was the occasion of Providence exerting itself in the Mosaic dispensation and thereby changing the manner of these temples, which were altogether polluted. Nevertheless, we have no reason to think but that the Druids in this island of ours generally kept up to the purity of their first and patriarchal institution." So that's an interesting quote, because when we look at the major monument right in the heart of England, Avebury, then we can see that this would have been a centre which would have been used for special occasions. But the main day-to-day business, meetings, rituals, and spiritual practices of this ancient faith of Druidry were held in nondescript places which could never be described, because Britain was covered in oak trees, as was most of Europe. The oak groves were the places of worship. So what we get from all of these writers and the history going back to the ancient monument builders is that the constructions were always of rude stones. That means unfashioned stones, untouched, upright in the ground, round in form, and open again in a circle. Avebury, huge circle. Stonehenge, a circle. In hot countries, groves were planted around them. So the circle at Avebury, the front part of the Avebury circle is the snake leading towards Kennet, and of course West Kennet Longbarrow, which is described as a passage grave. It has megaliths at its opening, and it is in fact full of, I think there's 4 different rooms in there. So these places were used for the depositing of bones later. This is what seems to be the case. And an article came up recently which confirmed this, which is what we've been saying, that the Longbarrows where these bones were found were not burial chambers. They were underground chambers, primitive bomb shelters. And that has now been confirmed by findings of bones which were not congruent to the age of the building of the Longbarrows. So in other words, they were used by much later people as burial chambers because they were already there. He describes the hind part of the snake leads towards Beckhampton, for they may well all be looked on as avenues to the great temple of Avebury, which part must be more eminently called the temple. So Avebury is one large open temple, along with the temporal natural temples of the oak groves, which were all over Britain and of course Europe, where this ancient religion spread to. Let's have another quote. "Out of this noble circle of stones, 100 in number, There was left in the year 1722, when I began to write, just over 40 still visible, whereof 17 were standing, 27 thrown down or reclining, 10 of the remainder, all contiguous, were at once destroyed by Tom Robinson in 1700, and their places perfectly levelled for the sake of the pasturage. So the farmer knocked down the sacred stones of Avebury. In the north entrance of the town, one of the stones of a most enormous bulk fell down and broke. It measured 22 feet long. Reuben Horsall, clerk of the parish, remembers when it was standing. And when my late Lord Winchelsea was there with me, we saw 3 wooden wedges driven into it in order to break it into pieces. So let's go to the future or the present. There are now 36 stones still standing out of an original estimated 154. If you look where the small amount of stones is, that will give you an idea when you look at the spacing as to how many there actually were. So we're going now to the Druidism of Britain by Dudley Wright. The inner enclosure of the Druid circle was always rough, unhewn stone, just as the Israelites had used the same, as we find in several Bible references. Exodus 25:26. And if you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stone, for if you use your tool on it, you have profaned it. Deuteronomy 27. This is about Mount Ebal. Build there an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones. Do not use any iron tool on them. So let's carry on now with the age of the green cathedrals. So the need for temples as places of worship has controlled the masses. Little more than communally enforced observance to repeated ritual and repetition, and the most successful control mechanisms being the Roman cult and Orthodox Judaism. Islam, of course, followed. They all work hand in hand at the top level. A look at the inaction against what's happening against fake Israel is a good example of where that led. And this project is coming to an end. So I'm going to give you some more information now. And we're going to talk, we've talked about Constantine before, you know, the Council of Nicaea and the imposition of this new fake Christianity onto the original Christianity and the relocation of the original Christianity to this newly named place called Israel. So Roman church building started, and this is really around the 313 AD onwards. And most of the ancient churches which we'll find in Britain are usually dated to around 600 AD, because that is, of course, when the Kentish kings were said to have converted to Christianity. And this was, of course, by Bartholomew, 597 AD. And he arrived in Kent, and King Ethelbert converted allegedly to Christianity. But nothing the Romans ever said can be taken with a pinch of salt. The only thing we can believe about the Romans is what they left, or what they say they left behind, because they usurped it off other people. So what the Romans were good at, their only skill in a way, was organization and administration. So the Roman church building started from about 313 AD. The Normans, of course, the Norman invasion, 1066 onwards, church building changed again in Britain, and then the Templar influence spread. And through the 12th to 16th centuries, of course, we had the age of cathedral building, the magnificence of the Gothic cathedrals of Europe. The early Christians, however, would meet in houses to avoid Roman interference. In fact, the oldest house church, allegedly, because we don't really know, but the oldest one that has been found and identified was Dura Europos in southeastern Syria, and it dates from 230 AD. It was originally a house which became a church. And as we said in the beginning part of the show, people used to meet in houses because the Christian religion was persecuted by the Romans. So this was originally a house and shared walls with surrounding houses. So it wasn't detached or on its own. And the church had a number of frescoes on the wall. So that was the beginning of church building. So the Druids, the use of the oak groves, along with, of course, the main outdoor cathedral in Britain, Avebury. Well, maybe the main outdoor cathedral in England, because, of course, we have the Calanesh stones, and we had stone circles around the British Isles, too numerous to mention here. But Avebury appears to be the centre. In my opinion, Stonehenge is actually a big distraction. And of course, they've put a road right through the middle of Avebury, which has disrupted whatever was there in the first place, which drew people there. So John Aubrey was the first historian to examine ancient Avebury. And he said, Avebury doth so much exceed Stonehenge in grandeur as a cathedral does an ordinary parish church. So Avebury was the main cathedral of ancient Britain, being a serpent temple. This is again referring to Avebury by William Stukeley. He gives a categorization of the different types of open air temple. So Avebury, he says, was a serpent temple. Others were round temples and winged temples. And this is really about the shape on the ground. So at the center of all these, of course, is a circle, never a square, which is very, very important. So when they say, are you on the square? You say, no, I worship in the open air directly, which means that you will never be a Freemason. Rollright stones in Chipping Norton, another very important site. And they were reported to have been used at the same time as people were using Avebury, and to a lesser extent Stonehenge. So the ancient Gaelic word for church and other things is reilig, R-E-I-L-I-G in Latin. And it can mean a grave or a burial place, a church or a crypt, or a burial place under a church, being a crypt, of course, stone chest where bones dug out of graves are placed. So the Roman Church used, of course, these kind of relics in its work. In fact, their obsession with necromancy runs through all of the Roman cult, including, of course, the altar slab in every Roman church. So the most important reilig shelters were dolmens, cromlechs, and these vaulted so-called passage graves, which have now officially been stated as not being graves. So we can say that we were right in the first place, and we can go back also to a very interesting documentary called The Last Druid with a fellow called Ben McBrady. You can see that on YouTube. And it really doesn't matter whether what McBrady was saying was actually in a way true. It's what he's saying. It's actually what he's saying. And it's very important because he talks about the ancient religion, and he talks about the ancient priest kings of Ireland. A very good documentary. If you want to get into that, it will give you some reference material. That's The Last Druid, Ben McBrady. Find it on YouTube or other platforms. So yes, the Domlex, the dolmens, the Domlex, cross between a dolmen and a cromlech. Dolmens and the cromlechs, and West Kennet Longbarrow with its megaliths at the doorway. So the dolmens and the cromlechs were very, very important because they were situated in places where people could go, and they would be near places, usually a little bit higher up than the places where people lived, so that they were good observatories also. And the dolmens that I've looked at all over the British Isles have all been in places which do not make sense if they're meant to be some sort of place of magical worship. They were very, very practical, and they were shelters because they were covered in earth. So there was room for the local priesthood in these places. If you look at Arthur's Seat in Monmouth, that's a great example because you've got the entrance, you've got quite a lot of room inside. You can also look at Lligwy, the dolmen in Lligwy. I mean, that is, well, it's a cromlech actually, because the dolmens were three-legged, and they had like this altar slab at an angle. But I think all used for the same type of activities. So the stone circles then were for public events and the private meetings that the Druids had, and their usual initiations, or what they wanted to be done really in private to small groups, were all done in the oak groves, which is why we know nothing about what went on then, because it was all in their minds. And this history has allegedly been passed down through the oral tradition. So there may be still people on this planet who know about it. What we do know for a fact is that there are many people on this planet who say they know about it, who clearly don't. And they congregate in several different places, which we've talked about before. So the stone circles were for public events, but worshipper meetings were all held in the oak groves. The oak was the protector of the Druids. And this is a very interesting thing, because it is a strong belief throughout Europe that the oak is a very lucky symbol. It's a symbol of life and death. So it's a symbol of the creation. It's a symbol of the destruction. The density of oak forests in Britain is only something we can imagine now. We're talking about a countryside that would have been full of forest. So there were plenty of hiding places away from the Romans. So what the Romans actually knew about the Druids is probably quite little, because the Druids who were actually in charge and in touch with the Caesars, well, they were the front face of Druidry. And of course, there's always the real story and the cover story. Back to William Stukeley again and his book Avebury. And when they built temples properly, they were round with open roofs. So the sky is the true ceiling, nothing before it. This is why the great cathedrals had such high roofs, of course, filled with iconography and frescoes, to implant the Roman version of reality in Constantine's control system, really through the use and manipulation of Christianity for the masses, not what it was originally. See our show, The Force They Fear, where we talk about the power of the original Christianity, which we also talked about in the Apostles of Albion, and that the ancient sites around Glastonbury were very, very important, and that Joseph of Arimathea visited Britain, Cornwall and Devon and Glastonbury, where Joseph, after the death of Jesus, planted the thorn bush on Weary All Hill, which was vandalized several years ago. Take a look at that show, The Apostles of Albion. I find this stuff very fascinating, because when we hear about this and look into it, a good idea is to go and have a bit of a look around the area and see what impressions you actually get. So let's go now to Riddle of Prehistoric Britain by Comins Beaumont. Carnac on the west coast of Brittany, with its many stone avenues, may have exceeded what actually was at Avebury in the total area, but Carnac is so dilapidated a state that its original outlines are confused. Yeah, that's a very good point, because with Avebury we can see it was from the idea of like the Iron Age forts, where we've got the circular structure surrounding it. So with Avebury we can immediately see the actual shape and the size of it, even though the stones are gone. But in Carnac it's more difficult. And of course in Normandy we've got these whole rows and rows of stones, and it's quite confusing to look at. So if we compare them to Avebury, we've got an intact idea of how it looked when it was built. So we again get quotes about the serpent aspect of Avebury. So Avebury and Stonehenge. It is noteworthy that both Avebury and Stonehenge, situated not far apart, both astronomical temples erected on the chalk, both round temples, both related to the same movement of the sun, show considerable difference in detail. Avebury, of far greater dimensions, was constructed entirely of unhewn monoliths, whereas the outer circle of Stonehenge was squared, dressed, capped with lintels, mortised, and beautifully finished off with the use of quartzite pebbles, yielding evidence of far later construction than Avebury, and in my opinion far less importance than Avebury, which is of course why all the focus is now on Stonehenge, which is why of course the New Agers are funneled there every year, because it is not and was never the main area of open air temple worship in Britain. So he says, on the other hand, the inner horseshoe-shaped ring of Stonehenge was built of unhewn stones foreign to the region. A special interest lies in these ancient monuments because their numbers and distribution point ostensibly to the British Isles as their seat of origin. So this goes into the theory that there was an advanced civilization. The comet of 1322 BC blew apart the landmass, which Beaumont believes could have been what Plato was referring to in his vision Critias of Atlantis. We've already done quite a lot of stuff on Atlantis. I don't like to get too involved in it, but the idea that the northern hemisphere had this huge continent, and of course the Hebrides and the Shetland Isles are the remains of that continent, and that is why those islands are so important today. And the island of Iona, which is of course mythologically stated as being risen from the sea, and it will never ever again sink, which is why they bury people who may be of an interest to the state there. Yes. So let's go again back to the riddle of prehistoric Britain. We find them, however, especially cromlechs, he's talking about cromlechs and dolmens here, in various distant parts of the earth. That's true because there are dolmens in Korea. There's dolmens in India. They're all over the place. But the idea is that after the cataclysm, they spread out. So people around the world would be suffering from these cataclysms. And we're talking about people who did move around. We, of course, have talked about this a lot. And when we have the recent findings about the Phoenicians, this is why they were separate from the Canaanites. They were a different people. They weren't from the Levant. They were people who traveled there. So Carthage was their base, and the original Canaan was where these people were meant to have originated. This is not the case. They did not originate in the Levant. So, of course, we've talked about the Scythians. We've talked about the Vincia culture, which was later, which swept across what's called the Eurasian steppe all over Europe. The question is, did they come from the north, or did they come from the east, or did they come from the west? Historians will tell you that this swept over from the Mithraic side of Persia and went through what they call the Asian steppe into Mongolia. But there's no real evidence of that. And I've been looking at stuff for several weeks now, and the world of academia, all they know about is through what has been found. So when they say there's a central place of a culture, it just means they found something there and they haven't found it anywhere else. And when you really look at this stuff, you realize that the world of academia is constantly correcting itself, but within the confines of their own belief system. So when you look into this and you start reading these articles from all these archaeological magazines around the world, it's very clear that none of this is, to use a relevant quote, set in stone. It's constantly being revised and reviewed. So yes, the idea was that in various distant parts of the earth, we still find these cromlechs and dolmens. And what is most strange about it is that almost without exception, they are non-existent in these sites where we are meant to find them. In other words, in the sites which are recorded in the Bible, which may well have not been in the place which we are now told through Constantine that they were in, because none have been found there. Okay, so this is what Beaumont says, that they were attributed to the early Bible and Greek peoples who erected sacred stones and altars to their gods, particular to three among them, Saturn, Hercules, and Hermes. These gods, of course, have different aspects and different names and are not really of that much interest with what we're talking about here. But he says, furthermore, the wide distribution of these unhewn stones indicates the movements of the race which erected these characteristic monuments and points to the prehistoric activities of an adventurous, and of course, as we've said, maritime people who sailed far distances in ships which dared the oceans. International commerce has been going on for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So let's now go to the riddle of prehistoric Britain. Dion, the Greek philosopher in the time of the Roman Empire, says that Druids were the real rulers of Britain and Gaul. And they, as we've said and presented evidence for, adopted and went along very much with the early Christianity. this all ties in with Joseph of Arimathea visiting Britain. Again, look at the show we did, The Apostles of Albion. I'm going to give you something to look at here in a quote. Hector Boethius, or Boethius. Now, Hector Boethius, Boethius, was a Scots historian of the 15th century, and he's written what is in effect the entire history of Scotland up to that point. He said that the Druids of Gaul and Ireland looked to Britain as their spiritual home, especially to Alba, the Scottish lowlands, where heroes and seers gained the greatest knowledge. Again, we're going back to the real Jerusalem. The real Jerusalem, which is now called Edinburgh. He said this knowledge was only imparted to specially selected persons, and then by gradual degrees, novitiates having to undergo the most severe tests and rites before admission to initiation into their innermost secrets, and to betray these meant excommunication or even death. Druidism was indeed, says Hector Boethius, the father of Freemasonry, which also, of course, had Scandinavian roots, which the Freemasons copied. The bards carried on the Druidic knowledge. This is interesting because we have this Welsh bardic tradition that kind of romanticized the Druids. And of course, the Druids had the Druids, the bards, and the Vates. The Vates were really involved in what we could call cookery or sacrifice. And the bards, of course, were poets, and not only poets, interestingly, they were like bookkeepers and record keepers. So the Romans were very good at administration, but the Druids also had a very good system of administration. So according to Druidic knowledge, the bards later stated this knowledge was handed down, that all must be done in the face of the sun and the eye of light, which of course ties in with the teachings of Jesus. So nothing was in secret. That's the whole idea. So if you worshipped in an oak grove, if you worshipped in an open air real temple without a ceiling, then you were opposite to the closed, square, initiate, occult, misleading hamster wheel of going nowhere that is Freemasonry. So in other words, the two things are diametrically opposed, which I think is really one of the major points of this show. So when you talk about being on the square, it is diametrically opposed to being in the circle. So nothing in secret. Your confession was between you and God, your conscience, the guide, and the Druidic priests, the holders of certain knowledge. Well, Pliny the Elder was of the opinion that the British Druids might have taught this art to the Persians, which is quite interesting because we're always told that the Persian astrotheology, Zoroastrianism, Mithraism exported outwards. But it's a really interesting thing because the empire of Persia was built up, we're told, very, very quickly and very, very advanced. Very much tying in with, well, similarities to what happened in Mesopotamia and Sumeria. So again, we're talking about places that were probably connected way before academia tells us that they were. So Beaumont states, I believe prehistory will support this view and that the Persian kings owed their knowledge primarily to British Druids. So the mistletoe and the oak. Pliny in his Natural History gives a description of the plant and the mode of gathering it. The Druids, for so call they their magi, have nothing more sacred than the mistletoe and the tree on which it grows, provided it to be the oak. They select a particular grove of oaks and perform no sacred rites without oak leaves, so that from this custom they may seem to have been called Druids or Oakites. So yes, the Greek for this is actually drys, D-R-Y-S in Latin, not in Greek, of course. It's just that's the phonetic sound. So according to the Greek interpretation of that word, yes, we have the drys, which were Druids. They reckon whatever grows on these trees is sent down from heaven and a proof that the tree itself is chosen by the deity or God. But the mistletoe is very rarely found, and when found is sought after with the greatest religious ardor, and principally in the 6th moon, which is the beginning of their months and years. And when the tree is 30 years old, it is then not half grown, but only when it has attained full vigor. So they were very particular about the places where they took their mistletoe from. So the cult became known by the term Judaism by the 15th century. This term that became used, this term Judaism, is a 15th century invention. So we're getting on now to the so-called the Jewish name for the supreme being Jehovah, means the self-existent, according to William Stukeley, or to adopt the term employed by Maimonides, the eternal. Well, of course, this has changed so much throughout time, and it depends who you ask if you go into that particular cult. But among the Druids, Bel was the name given to the supreme, the meaning of which is he that is. The Hebrews worshipped the eternal under the name of Baal. So who copied who? Thus we read in Hosea 2:15, and it shall be at that day, saith the Lord, that thou shalt call me Ishi and shalt call me no more Baal. This was because the Israelites had become idolaters and served other deities under the name of Baal, which is, of course, Moloch, meaning king. And the Hindu version of this is Bahal, Bahal in Latin. So Druids, bards, and vates each measured time by day and night, daytime existing separately from nighttime. Grove worship was in common to both Israelite and Druid, and grove worship usually happened when there was still daylight, often at dusk and when it was cooler, because, of course, Britain was a lot warmer in these times. It is clear from the many references to the oak in the Old Testament that it was regarded as a sacred tree. So let's see what the Old Testament now says about the oak. There are too many to mention, of course, but if we go to Genesis 35:4, hid them under the oak which was by Shechem. Judges 6:11, and sat under an oak which was in Ophrah. 2 Samuel 18:9, and brought it unto him under the oak and presented it. Samuel 18:19, of a great oak and his head. Too many of them to read out here. This is an interesting one. Chronicles 10:12, their bones are under the oak in Jabesh. Isaiah 6:13, for ye shall be as an oak. Ye shall be as an oak. So plenty of oak references in the Bible. Just put it up because Bible Gateway comes in. You can look at all of the actual passages that refer to oak trees if you're interested. Let's get back to the riddle of prehistoric Britain. So it was the Druids who set up sacred stones as cromlechs and dolmens, as megalithic round temples, and as idols of their deities. These stones, of course, being unhewn, natural, untouched, because their belief was that the mason's tool defiled them. Hence we get Freemasonry defiling the real temple. They erected their temples in places which were holy in their eyes, or places that they doused themselves and were actually natural places to go in the natural order. And of course, the Church of Constantine used these ancient places because they were popular for thousands of years, and they built these new churches in these places for their new interpretation of the cult of Christianity, which they put out through before the Council of Nicaea. So from 313 AD, we can find that the Roman Church started building its own temples. Cromlechs and dolmens, says Bowman, are usually regarded as one and the same, but there is an apparent difference, as we've just said earlier. I think we preempted this. The cromlechs from Gael, crom, bent, crooked, inclined, and a lek is a stone. So basically we've got a crooked or inclined stone. That's a cromlech. It stands uncovered, sometimes in the center of a Druidic circle, and was properly an altar. So this is a very interesting point, that these cromlechs that are really in the middle of nowhere were in places where there probably had been many, many oak trees, because, well, the one in Lligwy in Anglesey, for instance, is in the middle of a field in the middle of nowhere, and they dragged the 25-ton capstone, and a lot of these domlechs, I've invented a new word tonight. Yes, a lot of these cromlechs were actually having altar stones which went up to nearly 100 tons. There are reports of them having been 100 tons, of course. So the dolmen is from dole, a table, and men or main meaning stone. So that's a dolmen, a table stone, stone table. Forms often a cluster of unhewn stones, not uncommonly a gallery of several blocks, raised on pillars and concealed under a covering of stones or soil, with an opening sometimes leading to a chamber approached by a passageway. They are regarded as tombs, and in many of them skeletons have been found. So Beaumont knew that these places were not tombs, but bones had actually been deposited there. So these were the primitive bomb shelters. These could have been places where people gathered, and they could have assembled inside the larger ones. And of course, they were also the primitive bomb shelters where people would have gone when and if there was a barrage raining from the sky. So this main May Day celebration that we hear about was the Druids' main festival. It was in honor of the spring when the sun entered the sign of Taurus the bull, and we have similarities with Osiris, Shiva, and Bacchus, all represented by living bulls. So where did this come from? Because we have some interesting information from different authors who state that Hinduism is not actually as old as it's stated to be. And that is quite interesting, because Hinduism is a huge collection of beliefs. And it's very, very hard to date those beliefs and those stories, because they have been mutated and retold over time. So Druids were actually known as the Masons, the sons of May. This is where the usurpers maybe copied their knowledge. So they call themselves the Masons after their square stone temples, but the original Masons were the sons of May after their May Day festival. So to put things into perspective and start to round up what we've been talking about tonight, William Stukeley and Avebury. This I verily believe to have been a truly patriarchal temple, as the rest likewise which we have here described, and where the worship of the true God was performed in the British Isles. And I conclude with what Epiphanius writes. Speaking of the old religion from the beginning of the world, he affirms Adam and all from him to Abraham were no other than Christians, and this is the doctrine of the apostle of the Gentiles. So by the tree came death, and by the tree came life. So the oak was the original resurrection before Jesus. And so the true theology communicated to mankind from the beginning was perverted into polytheism and idolatry, ritual and religion. So do look at that show, Ritual and Religion. It's in the archive, describes what we've been talking about tonight. So religion took over from Religio, the direct experience. As a reminder, Religio, in its most refined meaning, is communion with God. But of course, there are obstacles on this journey, and the only way to refine a connection to the unified field of the divine is to work on a full-time connection, which is what these people were doing in their places of true worship, establishing a true connection. That is the one and only accomplishment that is of any importance. Everything else is a distraction or illusion, as all true reality is revealed in divine inspiration through direct contemplation, or to make it simpler, the Holy Spirit. We have learned and heard the mantra, everything else is just an illusion. And in this case, it appears it is true, and it appears this is what our ancestors were trying to tell us. So, hope you enjoyed that. And I will be carrying on with several shows along these lines, and I will keep putting out the lifelong learning project. It won't be on a particular day over the next several months, but it will be announced on the YouTube channel, because we're back on here. Do go into the archive at windowsontheworld.net, because there's over 200 shows that have never been on YouTube, and there are probably about 50 to 100 that have been removed by YouTube. So go to the homepage at windowsontheworld.net and go to the live shows page, and you will find 400 and something, over 425 shows, which are all packed with information and go back about 7 or 8 years now. And we go back to 2008 in our archive. So if you'd like to support the show, please do, and keep in touch through the website info@windowsontheworld.net. I'm going to have a look at the comments now because I haven't wanted to get distracted. So great. See you all soon on Windows on the World, and it will be more regular from now on. We just had a short break.